The frigid wind howled across the vast Wyoming landscape, cutting through Bethany Moore's threadbare coat as she trudged through knee-deep snow, her 3-month-old daughter Clara bundled against her chest. The year was 1878, and Bethany had never felt more alone in her 22 years of life. Her husband Thomas had been dead for 2 months now, victim of a mining accident that had shattered her world and left her with nothing but debts and a tiny baby to care for. "Just a little further, sweet girl," Bethany whispered, her breath forming clouds in the bitter January air. "We'll reach Pinewood by nightfall, and then we'll find somewhere warm." She'd sold everything they owned in Coleridge, the small mining town that had been their home for the past year, to pay off Thomas's debts. All that remained was the gold locket around her neck containing a small portrait of her late husband, a bundle of clothes, and the last of their money sewn into the hem of her dress. Bethany had heard that Pinewood, some 15 miles away, was a growing town with opportunities for work. With a baby to feed and winter settling in hard, she'd had no choice but to make the journey on foot. The snow had started falling again, heavy flakes that reduced visibility to mere yards. Clara whimpered against her chest, and Bethany adjusted the blankets around her daughter's tiny face. "Hush now, my love," she soothed, even as fear gripped her heart. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and darkness would fall within hours. She wasn't sure they would make it to Pinewood before nightfall, and the prospect of spending the night in the open terrified her. Her legs burned with exhaustion, each step becoming more labored than the last. The road, barely visible beneath the fresh snow, wound through a dense pine forest that offered little shelter from the relentless wind. Bethany fought back tears of frustration and fear. She couldn't afford to give in to despair, not with Clara depending on her. It was then that she heard it, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats cutting through the howl of the wind. Bethany turned, squinting through the falling snow to see a rider approaching. Her heart raced with both hope and trepidation. In these parts, strangers could mean help or danger. The horse, a powerful chestnut stallion, slowed as it neared her. Its rider, a broad-shouldered man in a heavy sheepskin coat and wide-brimmed hat, pulled back on the reins and regarded her with intense eyes beneath the shadow of his hat brim. "Madam," he called out, his voice deep and resonant against the winter silence. "What in God's name are you doing out here in this weather?" Bethany clutched Clara tighter, unsure whether to trust this stranger. "I'm headed to Pinewood," she replied, her voice trembling from cold and exhaustion. The man dismounted in one fluid motion, revealing his considerable height. As he stepped closer, Bethany could see he was perhaps 30 years of age, with several days' worth of stubble shadowing a strong jawline. His eyes, a striking blue against his wind-burned face, held no malice, only concern. "That's still 8 miles off," he said, frowning as he noticed the bundle against her chest. "Is that a baby?" Bethany nodded, instinctively shifting to protect Clara from his view. The man's expression softened immediately. "Madam, you'll never make it to town before dark. Not in this weather. Not with a little one." He gestured to the sky, where the clouds hung heavy and threatening. "There's worse coming." As if to emphasize his point, the wind picked up, driving icy pellets of snow against their faces. Clara began to cry, a thin wail that cut Bethany to the core. The stranger seemed to make a decision. He stepped closer, careful to move slowly as though approaching a skittish animal. "My name's Vaughn Miller. I've got a cabin about a mile from here. Let me help you, madam. Let me carry you both instead." Bethany hesitated, weighing her limited options. The man Vaughn seemed genuine in his concern, and the reality was that she and Clara might not survive the night if they continued their journey. "I don't mean any harm," Vaughn added quietly, as though reading her thoughts. "I've got a fire going and food to spare, just until the storm passes." Another gust of wind cut through Bethany's coat, and Clara's cries grew stronger. It was that sound, the distress of her daughter, that made the decision for her. "Thank you," she said simply, too exhausted to say more. Vaughn nodded, then moved to his horse. "I'll take you both up with me. Thunderhead here is strong enough to carry us all a short distance." He mounted first, then reached down with strong arms. Bethany allowed him to lift her and Clara onto the horse in front of him. His chest was solid and warm against her back, his arms forming a protective circle around her and the baby as he gathered the reins. "Hold on now," he instructed, urging the horse forward. "I've got you both." Bethany leaned back slightly, allowing some of her weight to rest against him. For the first time in months, since Thomas's death, she felt a sense of security wash over her. As Thunderhead picked his way carefully through the snow, Bethany closed her eyes briefly, offering a silent prayer of thanks for this unexpected mercy. Vaughn's cabin appeared through the trees just as the daylight began to fade in earnest. It was a substantial structure, larger than Bethany had expected, a log home with smoke curling from a stone chimney. A barn stood nearby, and a corral, now empty, suggested that Vaughn kept more than just the one horse. He dismounted first, then carefully helped Bethany down, one hand firmly supporting her elbow as her feet touched the ground. Clara had fallen asleep, lulled by the steady motion of the horse. "Let's get you both inside," Vaughn said, leading Thunderhead toward the barn. "I need to see to my horse first, but the door's unlocked. Go on in and warm yourself by the fire." Bethany nodded gratefully and made her way to the cabin door. Inside, she found a tidy, well-kept home. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a cheerful fire already burning low but steady. The main room contained a solid wooden table with 4 chairs, a comfortable-looking armchair near the fire, and shelves lined with books, more books than Bethany had seen outside of a schoolhouse. A door led to what she presumed was a bedroom, and a ladder against one wall suggested a loft space above. She moved immediately to the fire, careful not to wake Clara as she soaked in the blessed warmth. The cabin smelled of wood smoke, coffee, and something else, a hint of leather and pine that she would later come to associate with Vaughn himself. The door opened a few minutes later, bringing with it a swirl of cold air and snowflakes. Vaughn stomped his boots on the threshold before entering, carrying Bethany's small bundle of possessions that had been tied to his saddle. "Your things, madam," he said, setting the bundle on the table. He removed his hat and coat, hanging them on pegs by the door. His dark hair was longer than was fashionable, curling slightly at the nape of his neck. "Thank you, Mr. Miller," Bethany said, suddenly aware of how bedraggled she must look. "I'm Bethany Moore, and this is my daughter, Clara." "Pleased to meet you both, Mrs. Moore, though I wish it were under better circumstances." He moved to the fire, adding another log. "You must be hungry. I've got stew that can be heated, and fresh bread from yesterday." As he spoke, he busied himself at the small stove in the corner, giving Bethany a moment to study him. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to physical labor, but there was a gentleness to his actions that belied his imposing size. He wasn't dressed like a typical cowboy or rancher. His clothes were of good quality, if well worn. "You're very kind," Bethany said. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't come along." Vaughn turned, his expression serious. "No one should be out in weather like this, especially not with a baby. What brings you to these parts, if you don't mind my asking?" The question was gently put, but Bethany felt tears threatening again. She swallowed hard, determined not to break down in front of the stranger who had already shown her such kindness. "My husband died in November," she said, her voice steady despite the pain that still accompanied the words. "There was nothing left for us in Coleridge, so I'm heading to Pinewood to find work." Vaughn's face registered sympathy without pity, a distinction Bethany appreciated. "I'm sorry for your loss, Mrs. Moore. That's a heavy burden to bear alone." Clara stirred against Bethany's chest, making small sounds of wakefulness. Bethany shifted her position, and the baby's eyes opened, blinking in the firelight. "She has your eyes," Vaughn observed, setting a pot of stew to heat on the stove. Bethany smiled, the first genuine smile in what felt like ages. "Yes, though she has her father's chin, I think." Clara wriggled more insistently now, her face scrunching in preparation for a cry that Bethany recognized all too well. "She's hungry," she explained, suddenly uncomfortable. "Is there somewhere I might?" Understanding immediately, Vaughn gestured to the bedroom door. "Of course. Please use my room. Take all the time you need." Grateful for his sensitivity, Bethany retreated to the bedroom to feed Clara. It was a simple space with a large bed covered in a patchwork quilt, a chest of drawers, and a small writing desk beneath the window. Like the main room, it was surprisingly tidy for a bachelor's quarters. As Clara nursed, Bethany allowed herself to consider their situation. They were safe for the night, at least. Tomorrow, she would thank this kind stranger and continue to Pinewood as planned. There, she would find work perhaps as a seamstress or laundress and build a new life for herself and Clara. It would be hard, especially with a baby to care for, but Bethany was no stranger to hard work. She thought of Vaughn Miller, with his steady blue eyes and gentle manner. What was his story? He didn't strike her as a typical frontiersman, despite his evident capability. There was an educated quality to his speech, and those books in the main room suggested a man of some learning. Clara finished nursing and Bethany adjusted her clothing before returning to the main room. Vaughn had set the table with 2 bowls of stew, a loaf of bread, and mugs of coffee. He stood when she entered, pulling out a chair for her with old-fashioned courtesy. "Please sit," he said. "You must be starving." Bethany settled Clara in the crook of her arm and sat down, suddenly aware of how ravenous she was. The stew was simple but delicious chunks of venison with potatoes, carrots, and onions in a rich broth. "This is wonderful," she said after a few bites. "Do you hunt the deer yourself?" Vaughn nodded, breaking off a piece of bread. "I try to keep the smokehouse full before winter sets in. The deer are plentiful in these parts." "You live here alone?" Bethany asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. "I'm sorry, that's none of my business." "No need to apologize," Vaughn replied easily. "Yes, it's just me. Has been for 5 years now." "It's a lovely home," Bethany said sincerely. "Larger than I expected for one person." A shadow crossed Vaughn's face briefly. "I built it with a family in mind once upon a time." The simple statement held a wealth of untold story, but Bethany didn't press. They ate in companionable silence for a while, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the howl of the wind outside. "The storm's getting worse," Vaughn observed, glancing toward the window where snow pelted against the glass. "You're welcome to stay until it passes. Might be a couple of days, from the look of those clouds." Bethany's initial instinct was to refuse. She had already imposed enough, but practicality won out. "That's very generous of you, Mr. Miller. If you're certain it's no trouble." "No trouble at all," he assured her. "And please call me Vaughn." "Bethany," she offered in return. Clara, fed and warm, had fallen asleep again. Vaughn watched the baby with something like wonder on his weathered face. "How old is she?" he asked softly. "Just over 3 months," Bethany replied. "She was born in early October. Thomas, my husband. He only had a few weeks with her before the accident." Vaughn's expression turned somber. "Mining accident, you said?" "Yes. He was working a new seam when there was a collapse. 3 men died that day. Bethany swallowed hard against the memories. The company paid for the burial but nothing more. They said Thomas had signed something waiving their liability. Anger flashed briefly in Vaughn's eyes. The mining companies are good at protecting themselves, not so good at protecting their workers. There was bitterness in his tone that suggested personal experience, but before Bethany could respond, Clara stirred and began to fuss. "She needs changing," Bethany said, rising from the table. "I have some cloths in my bundle." "Take whatever you need," Vaughn said, standing as well. "I'll clear the table." Bethany tended to Clara, marveling at how comfortable she felt in the stranger's home after just a few hours. There was something about Vaughn Miller that inspired trust, a steadiness, a quiet strength that reminded her a little of her father, though Vaughn couldn't be more than a few years older than her own 22 years. When she returned to the main room, Vaughn had cleared the dishes and was adding more wood to the fire. Outside, the storm raged on, wind battering the sturdy log walls of the cabin. "You can take the bedroom," Vaughn said, straightening up from the fireplace. "I'll sleep out here." "I couldn't possibly put you out of your bed," Bethany protested. "The chair by the fire will be fine for Clara and me." Vaughn shook his head firmly. "I won't hear of it. The bedroom is yours for as long as you stay. I often sleep out here anyway when I'm up late reading." He gestured to the loft. "Besides, there's another bed up there if I want it. It's just easier to stay warm down here in the winter." Recognizing that further argument would be futile, Bethany nodded gratefully. "Thank you for everything." Vaughn smiled, the expression transforming his solemn face. "You're welcome, Bethany." That night, as Bethany lay in Vaughn's comfortable bed with Clara sleeping peacefully beside her, she listened to the storm outside and offered silent thanks for the unexpected sanctuary they had found. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges, but for now, they were safe, warm, and fed blessings she had feared might elude them on this desperate journey. In the main room, Vaughn settled into the armchair with a book, though his thoughts kept straying to the woman and child sleeping in his bedroom. It had been a long time since he'd had company, longer still since he'd spoken to a woman as lovely and dignified as Bethany Moore. Despite her obvious hardship, there was a quiet strength about her that he admired. He thought of her trudging through the snow with her baby clutched to her chest, determined to reach safety through sheer force of will. The image stirred something in him, something he had thought long buried after Catherine's betrayal 5 years ago. Shaking off these unexpected feelings, Vaughn returned his attention to his book. Bethany and her daughter would be gone in a day or two, continuing on to Pinewood to build a new life. Their paths had crossed briefly, a chance encounter in a snowstorm. Nothing more. Yet as he stared at the dancing flames in the fireplace, Vaughn couldn't quite convince himself that this was true. Morning arrived with unrelenting snow still falling from a leaden sky. Bethany woke to Clara's hungry cries and the unfamiliar comfort of a real bed. For a moment, disoriented by sleep, she reached instinctively for Thomas before reality crashed back. The mining accident, the funeral, the desperate journey through the snow, Vaughn Miller's unexpected kindness. She fed Clara, changed her, and tidied herself as best she could with the limited resources in her bundle. Her dress was worn but clean, her hair simply braided. She had never been one for vanity, but she found herself wishing for a decent mirror and perhaps a ribbon for her hair. When she emerged from the bedroom, she found Vaughn at the stove, frying bacon and eggs. The aroma made her stomach growl appreciatively. "Good morning," he said, turning at the sound of her footsteps. "I hope you slept well." "Better than I have in months," Bethany admitted. "Thank you again for your hospitality." "Happy to provide it." Vaughn nodded toward the window. "I'm afraid we're properly snowed in. The drifts are up past the windows in places." Bethany moved to look outside, Clara balanced on her hip. Sure enough, a wall of white pressed against the glass, and beyond what she could see, the world had disappeared into a swirling maelstrom of snow. "I've never seen such a storm," she said, a hint of awe in her voice. "Worst in years," Vaughn confirmed, transferring bacon to a plate. "We might be stuck here for a few days, I'm afraid." Bethany bit her lip, concerned. "I don't want to impose on your kindness any longer than necessary." Vaughn's expression turned serious. "Bethany, you're not imposing. I couldn't in good conscience let you and Clara venture out in this, even if there was a path to follow. Please consider yourself welcome here until the way is clear." The sincerity in his voice eased her worry somewhat. "At least let me earn my keep," she said. "I'm a fair cook, and I can help with chores." "I won't say no to help," Vaughn replied with a smile, setting plates on the table. "Though I manage well enough on my own most days." They ate breakfast, and Bethany found herself curious about this solitary man who seemed so at ease with himself and his surroundings. "Have you lived here long?" she asked, cradling Clara in one arm while eating with her free hand. 5 years, Vaughn answered. "I came west from Boston after some personal matters were settled." There was a careful neutrality to his tone that suggested the personal matters were not pleasant memories. "Boston? You're a long way from home." "That was the idea," he said with a wry smile. "I needed a fresh start, somewhere I could build something of my own." "And you chose Wyoming territory," Bethany mused. "It must have been quite an adjustment from city life." Vaughn nodded, his eyes distant with memory. "It was. But I had some experience with horses from my university days, and I'd always been drawn to open spaces. My father wanted me to follow him into law, but I never had the temperament for it." "You were to be a lawyer?" Bethany couldn't keep the surprise from her voice. It explained his educated manner, but it was hard to reconcile the image of a Boston attorney with the capable frontiersman before her. "That was the plan," Vaughn confirmed. "I even completed 2 years of law school before I realized I was living someone else's dream, not my own." Clara began to fuss, squirming in Bethany's arm. Without hesitation, Vaughn reached out. "May I?" he asked. Surprised, Bethany carefully transferred Clara to his waiting arms. Vaughn held the baby with unexpected confidence, cradling her against his broad chest as if he'd done so 100 times before. "You have a way with her," Bethany observed, taking advantage of her free hands to finish her breakfast. A shadow crossed Vaughn's face. "I had a younger sister. She was 12 years my junior, almost like my own child in some ways. I helped care for her a great deal." The past tense told Bethany all she needed to know. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Vaughn nodded, his attention on Clara, who had settled contentedly in his arms. "Scarlet fever 6 years ago. She was just 14. He cleared his throat. "My parents never really recovered from it. Neither did I suppose, though in different ways." The revelation explained something about him, the gentleness beneath the rugged exterior, the sorrow that sometimes shadowed his eyes. "Is that why you came west?" Bethany asked gently. "Partly," Vaughn replied. "There were other factors." His tone suggested the topic was closed, at least for now. They fell into an easy rhythm over the next 2 days as the storm continued unabated. Vaughn ventured out briefly each morning to tend to Thunderhead and his 2 other horses in the barn, returning with fresh milk from the cow he kept there as well. The rest of the time was spent indoors, sharing the duties of cooking, cleaning, and caring for Clara. Bethany discovered that Vaughn was well-read and articulate, with opinions on everything from politics to literature. Their conversations by the fire in the evenings became something she looked forward to, a connection to the wider world she had missed during her months of grief and struggle. For his part, Vaughn found himself increasingly drawn to Bethany's quiet strength and gentle humor. She told him of her childhood in Illinois, her marriage to Thomas at 19, and their journey west in search of opportunity. There was no self-pity in her tale, despite the hardships she had endured. On the third morning, Bethany awoke to silence. The howling wind had finally ceased. She dressed quickly and went to the window, pulling back the curtain to reveal a transformed world. The snow had stopped, and the sun shone brilliantly on an unbroken expanse of white stretching to the distant mountains. In the main room, she found Vaughn already dressed in his heavy coat and boots, preparing to go outside. "The storm's passed," he said, stating the obvious. "I need to check the horses and clear a path. The drifts are high, but the road to Pinewood should be passable by tomorrow if the weather holds." Bethany nodded, feeling a strange reluctance at the thought of continuing her journey. These days in Vaughn's cabin had been unexpectedly peaceful, a respite from the uncertainty that had plagued her since Thomas's death. "I'll have breakfast ready when you return," she said, forcing a cheerful tone. Vaughn studied her for a moment, as if wanting to say something more, then simply nodded and went out. Through the window, Bethany watched him trudge through the deep snow toward the barn, his broad shoulders set against the cold. She had learned much about him in their short time together: his love of books, his skill with horses, his dreams of expanding his small ranch. But there were still mysteries. The other factors that had driven him from Boston, the pain that sometimes darkened his eyes when he thought she wasn't looking. Clara babbled from her makeshift cradle, a drawer padded with blankets that Vaughn had provided, and Bethany lifted her daughter, pressing a kiss to her rosy cheek. "What do you think of our Mr. Miller, little one?" she murmured. "He's been very kind to us, hasn't he?" Clara responded with a toothless smile that warmed Bethany's heart. Despite everything, her daughter was thriving, growing stronger each day, untouched by the grief and worry that had been Bethany's constant companions. The door opened, bringing with it a blast of cold air, and Vaughn, his face flushed from exertion. "The drifts are nearly 5 feet high in places," he reported, stamping snow from his boots. "But the sky's clear. I'll start clearing a path after breakfast." Bethany nodded, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in her stomach. "I should be able to leave for Pinewood tomorrow then." Vaughn removed his coat and hat, hanging them by the door. "About that," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "I've been thinking." He crossed to the fire, warming his hands before continuing. "Winter's far from over, and traveling with a baby is hard enough in good weather. I wondered if you might consider staying here, at least until spring." Bethany stared at him, caught off guard by the suggestion. "Stay here? But I couldn't impose." "It's not an imposition," Vaughn interrupted. "The cabin's too big for just me, as you noted yourself. There's the bedroom for you and Clara, and I'm comfortable enough in the loft." He hesitated, then added, "And I won't pretend I haven't enjoyed the company." The offer was tempting, more than tempting. The prospect of continuing to Pinewood, of trying to find work and lodging with a baby in the depths of winter, had been weighing heavily on her. "I couldn't stay without contributing," she said slowly. "I don't have much money, but I could cook and keep house, perhaps do some sewing." "I'd welcome the help," Vaughn said, relief evident in his voice. "And when spring comes, if you still want to go to Pinewood, I'll take you there myself." It was a generous offer, one that solved her immediate problems while giving her time to plan for the future. Still, Bethany hesitated. "Why would you do this for us?" she asked quietly. "You hardly know me." Vaughn's blue eyes met hers steadily. "Because it's the right thing to do. Because no one should have to struggle alone if help is available. And because," he paused, seeming to choose his words carefully, "because I've been alone a long time, Bethany. Having you and Clara here these past few days has reminded me what it's like to share a home, to have conversation over meals, to hear laughter again." The simple honesty of his words touched her deeply. She thought of the months ahead, the harsh Wyoming winter, the challenges of finding work and housing in a strange town. Then she looked around the warm cabin that already felt more like home than anywhere she'd been since Thomas's death. "Until spring, then," she said, making her decision. "Thank you, Vaughn." His smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "You won't regret it, Bethany. I promise you that." And somehow, looking at his earnest face, she believed him. The days settled into a comfortable routine. Vaughn rose early each morning to tend to the animals and handle the heavier outdoor chores. Bethany prepared meals, kept the cabin tidy, and cared for Clara. In the evenings, they would sit by the fire, Vaughn often reading aloud from one of his many books while Bethany sewed or mended. January gave way to February, bringing more snow and bitter cold, but the cabin remained a haven of warmth and increasing companionship. Bethany found herself watching Vaughn when he wasn't looking, the way his hands, large and work-roughened, could be so gentle when holding Clara, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, the quiet competence with which he approached every task. For his part, Vaughn discovered a growing admiration for Bethany's resilience and grace. Despite all she had endured, she approached each day with determination and even occasional joy. He found himself looking forward to their evening conversations, to the sound of her humming as she worked, to the domestic tranquility that had been missing from his life for so long. One evening in late February, as a particularly fierce blizzard raged outside, Vaughn returned from a final check on the animals to find Bethany seated by the fire, Clara asleep in her arms. The scene struck him with unexpected force, the woman and child bathed in the golden glow of firelight, the peaceful expression on Bethany's face as she gazed down at her daughter. "She's finally asleep," Bethany whispered as he hung up his coat. "She's been fussy all afternoon." Vaughn moved quietly to join her by the fire, taking the chair opposite. "She's teething, I think. My sister was the same at her age. Nothing would settle her except being held." Bethany smiled, a hint of sadness in her eyes. Thomas never got to see any of this. He was so looking forward to watching her grow. Vaughn hesitated, then asked gently, "How did you meet him?" "Thomas, I mean, we grew up in the same town in Illinois," Bethany replied, her gaze still on Clara's sleeping face. "He worked in my father's store. We'd known each other most of our lives, but it wasn't until I turned 18 that he finally asked for permission to court me." She smiled at the memory. "He was so nervous. My father later told me he thought Thomas might faint before he got the words out." "He sounds like a good man," Vaughn said. "He was," Bethany confirmed. "Kind, hard-working, honest to a fault. When the store burned down and my father lost everything, Thomas suggested we head west where opportunities were better. We were married a month later." The firelight played across her features, highlighting the delicate curve of her cheek, the fullness of her lips. Vaughn found himself wanting to reach out, to touch her face, to offer comfort for all she had lost. Instead, he clasped his hands together, restraining the impulse. "And you?" Bethany asked, her voice soft in the quiet room. "You've never spoken much about Boston, about what brought you here besides your sister's passing." Vaughn was silent for a long moment, staring into the flames. He rarely spoke of Catherine and the betrayal that had finally driven him west, but something about the intimacy of the moment, the trust Bethany had shown in sharing her own story, made him want to reciprocate. "I was engaged," he said at last. "Her name was Catherine Spencer. Our families had been friends for generations, and the match was considered ideal by everyone, especially my father." Bethany waited silently for him to continue. "I thought I loved her," Vaughn went on, his voice distant with memory. "We had known each other since childhood, and marriage seemed the natural progression. But after my sister died, something changed. Catherine became impatient with my grief. She wanted me to move forward, as she put it. He paused, the old hurt rising to the surface despite the years that had passed. I came home early from the law offices one day and found her with my closest friend. They'd been carrying on an affair for months, it turned out. She told me later that my preoccupation with my sister's death had driven her to seek comfort elsewhere. Bethany's face reflected sympathetic understanding. That must have been devastating. It was, Vaughn admitted, not just the betrayal, but the realization that I'd been building my life on a foundation of expectations my father's, society's, even Catherine's. None of it was truly what I wanted. He looked up, meeting Bethany's eyes. So I left, withdrew from law school, bought a ticket west, and never looked back. My father disowned me, said if I was fool enough to throw away my education and prospects, I was no son of his. And your mother? Bethany asked gently. A small smile touched Vaughn's lips. She writes occasionally, sends books when she can. She's the only connection to Boston I've maintained. Bethany shifted Clara to her other arm, the baby sighing softly in her sleep. Do you ever regret it? Leaving everything behind? Vaughn considered the question seriously. No, he said finally. I regret the pain it caused my mother, and there are days I miss the conveniences of city life. But this, he gestured to encompass the cabin and the land beyond. This is where I was meant to be. I found a peace here I never knew in Boston. His eyes met hers again, and something passed between them, a current of understanding, of shared experience despite their different paths. And now, Bethany asked, her voice barely above a whisper, are you content with your solitude? The question hung in the air between them, laden with unspoken possibilities. Vaughn held her gaze, allowing himself to acknowledge the feelings that had been growing since that first day in the snow. I thought I was, he said truthfully, until you and Clara arrived. The admission changed something between them, acknowledged a shift that had been occurring gradually over the weeks they had shared the cabin. Bethany felt her heart quicken, both excited and apprehensive about what might lie ahead. Before either could speak further, Clara stirred and began to fuss. The moment broke, and Bethany rose to her feet. I should put her to bed, she said, a flush coloring her cheeks. Vaughn nodded, standing as well. Of course. Good night, Bethany. Good night, Vaughn, she replied, and there was a new warmth in the way she said his name that lingered in his thoughts long after she had disappeared into the bedroom. March arrived with the first hints of spring, longer days, occasional thaws that revealed patches of earth beneath the snow, the return of birdsong in the trees surrounding the cabin. Vaughn spent more time outdoors, preparing for the planting season and tending to the animals. 2 of his maras were pregnant, their foals due in late April or early May. Bethany found herself watching for his return each day, enjoying the way his face lit up when he entered the cabin to find her and Clara waiting. Clara, now nearly 6 months old, had begun to recognize Vaughn, reaching for him with chubby hands and babbling excitedly whenever he appeared. One afternoon, Bethany was hanging freshly washed clothes on a line Vaughn had strung near the cabin when she heard the sound of hoofbeats approaching. Looking up, she saw not Vaughn but a stranger riding toward the cabin, a tall man with a weathered face beneath a battered hat. Instinctively, she gathered Clara closer, wary of this unexpected visitor. Vaughn had gone to check fence lines on the far side of his property and wasn't due back for hours. The rider reined in his horse a respectful distance away and touched the brim of his hat. Afternoon, madam. I'm looking for Vaughn Miller. He's not here at the moment, Bethany replied, keeping her voice steady despite her apprehension. He should return before sunset if you'd like to wait. The man considered this, then dismounted. I'd be obliged. Name's Sam Harker. Vaughn and I have business to discuss. He was older than she had first thought, perhaps 50, with silver threading through his dark beard and lines etched deeply around his eyes. There was nothing overtly threatening in his manner, but Bethany remained cautious. "You're welcome to wait on the porch, Mr. Harker. I can bring you some coffee if you'd like." Harker nodded appreciatively. "That's kind of you, Mrs. Moore," Bethany supplied. "Bethany Moore." A look of surprise crossed the man's weathered features. "Didn't know Vaughn had taken a wife. Congratulations to you both." Bethany felt heat rush to her face. "Oh, no, you misunderstand. We're not," she stumbled over the words, flustered by the assumption. "Mr. Miller has kindly given my daughter and me shelter for the winter. We'll be moving on to Pinewood come spring." Harker's expression shifted to one of understanding, though there was a glint in his eye that suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. "I see. My mistake, Mrs. Moore." Bethany retreated to the cabin, returning moments later with a mug of coffee which she handed to Harker on the porch. He thanked her and settled into one of the chairs Vaughn had built, seemingly content to wait in silence. Clara grew restless, and Bethany took her inside to feed and change her, grateful for the excuse to escape the awkwardness of the situation. She wondered what business this Harker had with Vaughn. He didn't seem like the usual traders or neighbors who occasionally stopped by. It was nearly sunset when Vaughn returned, leading his horse at a walk up the path to the cabin. He spotted Harker immediately, his posture stiffening slightly before he raised a hand in greeting. "Sam," he called. "This is unexpected." Harker stood, setting aside the empty coffee mug. "Vaughn, been a while." Bethany watched through the window as the two men shook hands, cordial, but with a certain wariness that suggested their relationship was complicated. "Come inside," Vaughn said, gesturing toward the door. "You've met Bethany, I take it?" "Briefly," Harker confirmed, following Vaughn into the cabin. Bethany had Clara on a blanket on the floor, the baby happily playing with a wooden toy Vaughn had carved for her. She stood as the men entered, noting the slight tension in Vaughn's shoulders. "Bethany, this is Sam Harker," Vaughn said formally. "He owns the neighboring ranch to the east." "Sam, this is Bethany Moore and her daughter Clara." Harker nodded politely. "Madam, little miss. Mr. Harker was kind enough to wait for your return," Bethany said, looking to Vaughn. "He mentioned you have business to discuss." "Yes," Vaughn confirmed, his expression neutral. "Would you excuse us for a few minutes, Bethany? We can talk in the barn." "Of course," she replied, curious but not wanting to intrude. "Dinner will be ready in an hour or so, if Mr. Harker would care to join us." Harker looked surprised at the invitation, but Vaughn nodded. "Thank you, Bethany. We won't be long." The men left, and Bethany busied herself with preparing dinner, though her thoughts kept returning to the unexpected visitor and Vaughn's reaction to his arrival. There had been no hostility between them, but neither had there been the easy camaraderie Vaughn displayed with his other neighbors. True to his word, Vaughn returned within half an hour, alone. His expression was thoughtful as he hung his hat on its peg and moved to wash his hands at the basin. "Sam sends his apologies," he said, answering her unspoken question. "He needed to get back to his ranch before dark. Another time, perhaps." Bethany nodded, stirring the stew simmering on the stove. "Is everything all right? You seem surprised to see him." Vaughn dried his hands, his back to her. "Sam and I have a complicated history. He was the first person I met when I came west, gave me work on his ranch, taught me most of what I know about ranching. But we had a falling out a few years back over some business matters." He turned to face her, his expression clearing. "Nothing for you to worry about. He came to tell me he's selling his ranch and moving to California. Wanted to offer me first chance to buy some of his breeding stock before he puts them up for general sale." Bethany sensed there was more to the story, but Vaughn's tone suggested he didn't wish to discuss it further. She returned her attention to the stew, adding a pinch of salt. "Will you buy them?" she asked, keeping her tone conversational. Vaughn moved to lift Clara from her blanket, the baby gurgling happily at the attention. "I'm considering it. His Morgans are some of the finest in the territory. It would be a good investment if I can raise the money." The evening passed pleasantly enough, though Bethany noticed that Vaughn seemed preoccupied, his thoughts elsewhere despite his attempts at normal conversation. When Clara had been put to bed and the dishes washed, they sat by the fire as had become their custom. "There's something I've been meaning to ask you," Vaughn said after a companionable silence. "With spring approaching, I need to make a trip to Pinewood for supplies. I thought perhaps you and Clara might like to come along see the town, since that was your original destination." Bethany looked up from her mending, surprised by the suggestion. "When would we go?" "Next week, if the weather holds," Vaughn replied. "It's a full day's journey there and back, so we'd stay overnight at the hotel. I have some business at the bank as well." The prospect of seeing Pinewood was appealing. Bethany had been curious about the town that had been her intended destination all those months ago. Yet she felt a strange reluctance at the thought of leaving the safety and comfort of the cabin, even temporarily. "I'd like that," she said finally. "It would be good for Clara to have a change of scenery, and I should see what opportunities might be available there before spring is fully upon us." If Vaughn was disappointed by her reference to eventually leaving, he didn't show it. "Good. We'll take the wagon. It's more comfortable for you and Clara than riding horseback." The trip was planned for the following Wednesday, weather permitting. As the day approached, Bethany found herself both excited and anxious. She had grown accustomed to the quiet routine of life at Vaughn's cabin. The thought of returning to the wider world, with all its uncertainties and challenges, was daunting. The morning of their departure dawned clear and mild, the first truly spring-like day of the year. Vaughn had the wagon ready by sunrise, packed with empty crates for the supplies he would purchase and a comfortable seat arranged for Bethany and Clara. They set out as the sun crested the eastern mountains, the road to Pinewood now clear of snow though still muddy in places from the spring thaw. Clara, bundled warmly against the morning chill, was fascinated by the motion of the wagon and the changing scenery. Bethany found herself relaxing as they traveled, enjoying the simple pleasure of Vaughn's company and the beauty of the landscape awakening from its winter slumber. "It's beautiful country," she remarked as they crested a hill that offered a panoramic view of the valley below. "I can see why you chose to settle here." Vaughn nodded, his eyes scanning the horizon with evident satisfaction. "First time I saw this valley, I knew I was home. There's a freedom here you don't find back east. Space to breathe, to build something that's truly your own." His profile against the blue sky was strong and assured, and Bethany felt a surge of admiration for what he had accomplished. Starting with nothing but determination and a dream, he had created a life of independence and quiet dignity. "Do you ever think of going back?" she asked. "To Boston, I mean." Vaughn considered the question, his hands steady on the reins. "To visit my mother, perhaps someday. But not to stay. This is where I belong now." They reached Pinewood by early afternoon. It was larger than Bethany had expected, a proper town with a main street lined with businesses, a church with a white steeple, a schoolhouse, and neat houses spreading outward from the center. After the solitude of Vaughn's cabin, it seemed bustling and almost overwhelming. Vaughn guided the wagon to the general store first, where he introduced Bethany to the proprietor, a jovial man named Henry Simmons. While Vaughn discussed his order, Bethany browsed the shelves, Clara balanced on her hip. The store was well stocked, with everything from basic necessities to small luxuries: fabric, ribbons, books, and toys. "Your first time in Pinewood, Mrs. Moore?" Simmons asked as he wrapped a small wooden rattle Bethany had selected for Clara. "Yes," she replied. though I was headed here when the winter storm caught me. Mr. Miller was kind enough to offer shelter. Simmons nodded, his eyes twinkling. Vaughn's a good man, keeps to himself mostly, but always ready to help when needed. He handed her the wrapped package. Will you be settling in town now that spring's here? The question caught her off guard, though it was one she had been asking herself with increasing frequency. I haven't decided, she said honestly. I need to find work, of course. Well, if it's work you're looking for, you might speak with Mrs. Fletcher at the hotel, Simmons suggested. She mentioned needing help with the cleaning and cooking, especially with more travelers expected as the weather improves. Bethany thanked him for the information, tucking it away for consideration. After the general store, Vaughn took her to the hotel where he had reserved rooms for them. It was a modest but clean establishment, with a dining room that served simple meals to travelers and locals alike. I need to visit the bank before it closes, Vaughn said as they stood in the hotel lobby. Will you and Clara be comfortable here, or would you like to come along? We'll stay here, Bethany decided, noting Clara's drooping eyelids. She needs a nap after the excitement of the journey. Vaughn nodded, hesitating briefly before adding, I've arranged for us to have dinner with Doc and Mrs. Palmer this evening, if that's agreeable to you. He's the town physician, and his wife is one of the kindest women you'll ever meet. I thought you might enjoy some female company for a change. The thoughtfulness of the gesture touched Bethany deeply. That sounds lovely, Vaughn. Thank you. After he had gone, Bethany settled Clara in the small room they would share for the night. As the baby slept, Bethany sat by the window, looking out at the town that might have been her home these past months had fate not intervened. It seemed pleasant enough with its orderly streets and friendly inhabitants, yet she felt no connection to it, no sense of belonging. Her thoughts turned to Vaughn and the life they had shared through the winter. What had begun as an act of kindness on his part had evolved into something deeper, a partnership of sorts, built on mutual respect and growing affection. The thought of leaving that behind to start anew in Pinewood, or anywhere else, filled her with a sense of loss she hadn't anticipated. Dinner with the Palmers that evening was a delightful affair. Dr. Palmer was a distinguished gentleman in his 50s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles, while his wife Eliza was a warm, motherly woman who immediately took to Clara, cooing over the baby and pronouncing her perfectly formed in every particular. Vaughn tells us you're considering settling in Pinewood, Dr. Palmer said as they enjoyed a dessert of apple pie. We'd be delighted to have you, of course. The town could use more young families. Bethany glanced at Vaughn, who seemed suddenly interested in his coffee cup. I haven't made any firm decisions, she said carefully. Mr. Simmons at the general store mentioned Mrs. Fletcher might be looking for help at the hotel. Eliza Palmer nodded enthusiastically. Indeed she is, though if you'll permit me to say so, you seem educated enough for teaching. Our schoolmistress, Miss Carpenter, has been hoping for an assistant with the number of children increasing each year. The suggestion took Bethany by surprise. Teaching? I've never considered it, though I did complete my schooling in Illinois. Something to think about, perhaps, Dr. Palmer said with a smile. The position includes accommodations. The schoolhouse has rooms above it for the teacher. Throughout the conversation, Vaughn remained unusually quiet, offering only occasional comments. As they walked back to the hotel later, Clara asleep in Bethany's arms, she found herself wondering at his silence. The Palmers are lovely people, she ventured, hoping to draw him out. The best, Vaughn agreed. Doc Palmer set my arm when I broke it my first year here. Wouldn't take payment when he learned I was new to the territory and short on funds. They walked a few more steps in silence before Bethany gathered her courage to ask the question that had been on her mind all evening. Did you tell Dr. Palmer I was considering settling in Pinewood? Vaughn stopped walking, turning to face her in the light of the street lamp. His expression was difficult to read, a mixture of embarrassment and something else, something more vulnerable. "I may have mentioned that was your original plan," he admitted. Before the snowstorm, Bethany studied his face, trying to understand what lay beneath his words. "Is that what you want? For Clara and me to settle here in town?" The question hung between them, laden with unspoken implications. Vaughn's gaze held hers, his blue eyes serious in the lamplight. "What I want," he said slowly, "is for you to have choices, Bethany. Real choices, not decisions forced by desperation or limited options." It was both an honest answer and an evasion, and Bethany felt a flicker of frustration. "That doesn't answer my question, Vaughn." He sighed, running a hand through his hair in a gesture she had come to recognize as a sign of inner conflict. "No, it doesn't," he acknowledged. "The truth is, I don't know what I want," except he broke off, seemingly struggling with his words. "Except," she prompted gently, "except that the thought of you and Clara leaving, of going back to the way things were before you came, feels like—" He paused, searching for the right words. "It feels like losing something precious, something I didn't even know I was missing until you arrived." The simple honesty of his admission made Bethany's heart race. Before she could respond, Clara stirred in her arms, whimpering softly as she woke. "We should get her inside," Vaughn said, the moment broken. "It's getting chilly out here." Bethany nodded, allowing him to guide her the rest of the way to the hotel. But as she prepared Clara for bed in their room later, her thoughts kept returning to Vaughn's words and the emotion behind them. For the first time, she allowed herself to consider a future different from the one she had planned, not as a widow struggling to make ends meet in a new town, but as part of something more, something that included Vaughn and the life he had built. The following morning, they completed Vaughn's errands in town, loading the wagon with supplies for the coming months. Bethany purchased a few small items: fabric for a new dress, ribbons for Clara's growing hair, and a book of poetry that had caught her eye in the general store. As they prepared to leave, Mrs. Fletcher approached them outside the hotel, having heard from Simmons about Bethany's potential interest in employment. "We'd be pleased to have you, Mrs. Moore," the hotel proprietor said after introducing herself. "The position includes room and board for you and your little one, and the work isn't too demanding, mostly keeping the rooms tidy and helping with meals." "Thank you for the offer," Bethany replied sincerely. "May I have some time to consider it? I hadn't expected to make a decision so quickly." Mrs. Fletcher nodded understandingly. "Of course, dear. The position won't be filled before the end of the month, so you have time to think it over." As they rode out of town, Bethany found herself looking back at Pinewood with mixed emotions. It represented security, community, opportunities for herself and Clara, all the things she had sought when she set out from Coleridge months ago. Yet it lacked the one thing she had unexpectedly found at Vaughn's cabin: a sense of home. The journey back was quieter than their trip to town had been. Vaughn seemed lost in thought, his usual easy conversation replaced by long silences. Bethany, too, was preoccupied, turning over in her mind the decisions that lay ahead. They were about halfway home when Clara began to fuss insistently, hungry and tired of the constant motion of the wagon. Vaughn suggested they stop for a rest by a small stream that ran alongside the road, and Bethany gratefully agreed. While she fed Clara in the privacy of the wagon, Vaughn unhitched the horses to let them drink and graze. When Bethany emerged with a now contented Clara, she found him sitting on a fallen log by the stream, staring thoughtfully at the water. She joined him, settling Clara on a blanket spread on the new spring grass nearby. The baby immediately began to explore her surroundings, reaching for wildflowers with curious hands. "She's growing so fast," Vaughn observed, a smile softening his serious expression. "Seems like just yesterday she was barely lifting her head, and now look at her." Bethany nodded, watching her daughter with a mixture of pride and wistfulness. Sometimes I wish I could slow time, keep her this small a little longer. They sat in companionable silence for a few minutes, listening to the gurgle of the stream and Clara's happy babbling. It was Vaughn who finally broke the silence, his voice low and measured. "I've been thinking about what happens next," he said, not looking at her but keeping his gaze on the water. "When spring is fully here, and you make your decision about Pinewood." Bethany's heart quickened. "And what have you been thinking?" Vaughn turned to face her then, his expression more open and vulnerable than she had ever seen it. "I've been thinking that I don't want you to go," he said simply. "Either of you." The directness of his statement took her breath away. "Vaughn, please let me finish," he interrupted gently. "I know it's sudden, and perhaps presumptuous of me. We've known each other only a few months, and you're still grieving Thomas. I understand that, but these months with you and Clara have been the happiest of my life, Bethany." He reached for her hand, his touch warm and sure. "I'm not asking for any promises now, only that you consider staying not as my guest, but as more than that. In whatever capacity you're comfortable with, for as long as you need." Bethany looked down at their joined hands, emotions warring within her. Part of her, the practical, cautious part, knew that it was too soon, that decisions made in the aftermath of grief were often regretted later. But another part recognized the truth in Vaughn's words, the genuine connection that had grown between them through the winter months. "I care for you, Vaughn," she said at last, meeting his gaze, "more than I expected to care for anyone after Thomas. But I need to be certain for Clara's sake as much as my own that whatever decision I make is the right one, not just the comfortable one." Vaughn nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Of course, I'm not asking for an answer today, Bethany, only that you think about it." "I will," she promised, squeezing his hand. Truly, the remainder of the journey passed in easier conversation, the tension between them lessened by the words that had been spoken. When they arrived back at the cabin, it was with a sense of returning home that Bethany found both comforting and revealing. That night, after Clara was asleep, Bethany sat alone in the bedroom, Thomas's locket open in her hand. She gazed at his likeness, the kind eyes, the gentle smile she had loved since girlhood. For the first time since his death, she found she could look at his image without the crushing weight of grief overwhelming her. "What would you want for us, Thomas?" she whispered to the silent portrait. "For Clara to grow up loved and secure? For me to find happiness again?" There was no answer, of course, but as she closed the locket and held it to her heart, Bethany felt a sense of peace settle over her. Thomas had been a good man who had loved her without reservation. He would not have wanted her to spend her life alone, denying herself and Clara the chance for a family once more. The following weeks brought the full bloom of spring to the valley. Wildflowers carpeted the meadows, trees burst into leaf, and the days grew longer and warmer. Vaughn was busy from dawn till dusk, planting his vegetable garden, repairing fences damaged by winter snows, and tending to his pregnant mares. Bethany threw herself into spring, cleaning the cabin, airing out quilts and rugs, scrubbing floors and windows until everything gleamed. Clara thrived in the fresh air and sunshine, growing stronger and more active each day. She had begun to pull herself up on furniture, determined to stand, and her babbling had taken on the rhythms of speech, though no clear words had emerged yet. Mrs. Fletcher sent a letter via a passing trader, inquiring if Bethany had made a decision about the position at the hotel. The letter sat unanswered on the shelf above the fireplace, a reminder of the choice that still lay before her. Vaughn had been true to his word, never pressing her for an answer to his proposition. Their relationship continued much as before, though there was a new awareness between them, a current of possibility that hadn't existed during the winter months. It was in late April, as Bethany hung laundry on the line behind the cabin, that she heard Vaughn calling her name with unusual urgency. She hurried around to the front of the cabin to find him striding up from the barn, his face alight with excitement. "Come quickly," he said, reaching for her hand. "Starlight's foal is coming, and it's happening faster than I expected." Gathering Clara from her blanket on the porch, Bethany followed Vaughn to the barn. Inside, one of his prized maras lay on a bed of clean straw, her sides heaving with the effort of labor. Vaughn moved to the horse's head, murmuring reassurances as he stroked her neck. "Is this her first foal?" Bethany asked, hanging back to give the mare space. Vaughn nodded, his attention on the laboring animal. "Yes, and she's young. I've sent for Doc Palmer as a precaution, but I don't think he'll arrive in time." For the next hour, Bethany watched as Vaughn tended to the mare with gentle competence, his large hands sure and steady as he guided the birth process. Clara, fascinated by the proceedings, remained unusually quiet in Bethany's arms, her eyes wide as she observed. When the foal finally emerged, a leggy, chestnut colt with a white blaze down his face, Vaughn's expression of wonder and pride touched something deep within Bethany. He cleared the newborn's nose and mouth, then stepped back to allow the mare to nuzzle her baby, encouraging the foal's first attempts to stand on wobbly legs. "He's beautiful," Bethany breathed, moving closer now that the critical moment had passed. Vaughn looked up at her, his face transformed by joy. "He is, isn't he? Strong too. Look at him trying to stand already." Clara reached out toward the foal, babbling excitedly. The mare, exhausted but alert, watched them with liquid brown eyes, seemingly content to share this moment with the humans who had assisted in her labor. "What will you name him?" Bethany asked as the foal finally managed to stand, swaying on impossibly long legs. Vaughn considered for a moment, then smiled. "How about Miracle? Seems fitting, doesn't it?" Bethany nodded, understanding that he referred not just to the miracle of birth they had witnessed, but to something larger, the unexpected turns of fate that had brought them all together in this moment. Later, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and gold over the mountains, they sat on the porch watching the last light fade from the sky. Clara had fallen asleep inside, worn out by the excitement of the day. "I've been thinking about Mrs. Fletcher's offer," Bethany said quietly, breaking a comfortable silence. Vaughn turned to look at her, his expression carefully neutral. "Oh," Bethany nodded, her decision made at last. "I'm going to decline it." A spark of hope lit Vaughn's eyes, though he kept his voice even. "May I ask why?" She turned to face him fully, wanting him to see the certainty in her eyes. "Because this is where we belong, Vaughn. Clara and I. Here with you." The simple declaration hung in the air between them, its significance beyond the mere words spoken. Vaughn reached for her hand, his fingers entwining with hers. "Are you sure, Bethany?" he asked, his voice rough with emotion. "I don't want you to feel obligated, or to make this decision out of gratitude or—" "It's not gratitude," she interrupted gently, "though I am grateful for all you've done for us. It's not obligation either." She paused, finding the right words for what she had come to understand in the weeks since their return from Pinewood. "It's because when I think of home, I don't picture a place or a building. I picture this," she gestured to encompass the cabin, the land, and him. "I picture us together, the family we could be." Vaughn's face softened, hope giving way to something deeper, more certain. "I love you, Bethany," he said simply. "I think I have since that first day, when I found you carrying Clara through the snow." The words, so long unspoken between them, filled Bethany with warmth. "And I love you," she replied, the truth of it resonating through her entire being. I wasn't looking for love again, wasn't sure I could ever find it. But here it is, and I'm not afraid of it anymore. Vaughn raised her hand to his lips, pressing a gentle kiss to her knuckles. I'll do everything in my power to be worthy of that love, Bethany. To be a good husband to you, and a father to Clara. I know you will, she said with absolute confidence. Thomas will always be Clara's father by blood, and I'll make sure she knows about him as she grows. But there's room in her heart, in both our hearts, for you, Vaughn. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Vaughn drew her into his arms, his embrace both gentle and passionate. When their lips met in a first, tentative kiss, Bethany felt as though a chapter of her life was closing even as a new, promising one began. They were married 2 weeks later in a simple ceremony at the church in Pinewood, with Dr. and Mrs. Palmer as witnesses and Clara, dressed in a new white gown Bethany had sewn for the occasion, watching with solemn curiosity from Eliza Palmer's arms. Spring gave way to summer and summer to fall. Vaughn expanded the cabin, adding 2 new rooms, one for Clara and one for the baby they hoped would come in time. The purchase of Sam Harker's breeding stock had proven a wise investment, with Vaughn's reputation as a horse breeder growing throughout the territory. Bethany planted a garden, learned to ride, much to Vaughn's delight, and began teaching Clara her letters using the books that lined their shelves. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, watching the sun set over the mountains that had become as familiar to Bethany as the Illinois plains of her childhood. On a crisp October day, as the aspen trees turned golden on the mountainsides, Bethany and Vaughn stood at Thomas's grave in the small cemetery outside Coleridge. They had made the journey to honor the anniversary of his passing, bringing Clara to visit the father she would never know. Bethany placed a small bouquet of late wildflowers on the simple headstone, her heart full but no longer broken. Vaughn stood respectfully beside her, his hand warm and steady on her shoulder. He would be proud of her, Bethany said, watching Clara toddle among the gravestones, curious about everything. She has his determination. And your strength, Vaughn added softly. She's fortunate to have had 2 fathers who loved her, even if she'll only remember one. Bethany looked up at her husband, gratitude and love overwhelming her. Thank you for understanding, for making space for his memory in our lives. Vaughn's arm slipped around her waist, drawing her close. Our past makes us who we are, Bethany. Thomas will always be part of who you are, part of Clara. I wouldn't change that, even if I could. As they turned to leave, Clara ran to them, arms outstretched. Mama! Papa! She called, the words still new and precious on her lips. Vaughn scooped her up, settling her on his broad shoulders with practiced ease. Ready to go home, little one? Clara nodded enthusiastically, her small hands gripping his hair for balance. Bethany watched them together, her heart so full it seemed impossible it had once been shattered beyond repair. As they walked back to the wagon, Bethany's hand rested briefly on her stomach, where the first signs of new life had begun to make themselves known. She hadn't told Vaughn yet, wanted to be certain before sharing the joyful news. What are you smiling about? Vaughn asked, catching her expression. Bethany reached up to take his free hand, squeezing it gently. Just thinking about how sometimes the hardest journeys lead us exactly where we need to be. The winter of 1879 was milder than the previous year, with less snow and more clear, cold days that sparkled in the sunlight. On Christmas morning, Bethany finally shared her secret with Vaughn, presenting him with a tiny pair of baby booties she had knitted in anticipation of their child's arrival in early summer. His reaction, tears of joy and wonder, followed by laughter as he swung her gently around the room, was everything she could have hoped for. Clara, not quite understanding but caught up in the excitement, clapped her hands and demanded to be included in the celebration. That night, as they lay together in the darkness of their bedroom, Vaughn's hand resting protectively over the slight swell of Bethany's stomach. She reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. "Do you ever think about that day?" she asked softly. "When you found me on the road to Pinewood?" Vaughn's voice was thoughtful in the darkness. "Often. I nearly took a different route that day. There was a shortcut through the woods I sometimes used. If I had." "But you didn't," Bethany finished for him. "You were there when we needed you most." "I like to think it was more than chance," Vaughn admitted. "That somehow, we were meant to find each other." Bethany turned in his arms, finding his lips in the darkness. "I believe that too," she whispered against his mouth. "With all my heart." Outside, snow began to fall again, gentle flakes drifting down from a star-filled sky. But inside the cabin, all was warmth and love and the promise of tomorrow, a future built from the ashes of loss and the courage to begin again. In the years that followed, as their family grew and the ranch prospered, Bethany often thought back to that desperate journey through the snow. Clara clutched to her chest, hope fading with each labored step. How close they had come to a very different fate, and how completely their lives had been transformed by a chance encounter on a snowy road. "Let me carry you both instead," Vaughn had said that day. Not knowing he was offering far more than physical assistance, he was offering a new beginning. A second chance at happiness neither of them had been looking for, but both had desperately needed. And in accepting his offer, Bethany had found not just shelter from a storm, but a home for her heart. A place where past and present could coexist in peace, and where the future stretched before them like the vast Wyoming sky, limitless, bright with promise, and filled with love.